Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Bessma Momani on Arab youth. Hello and welcome to Season 6 of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. I'm David Welch, CIGI Chair of Global Security at the Balsillie School of International Affairs, and also a Senior Fellow here at the Center for International Governance Innovation. And it's our pleasure to welcome a guest into the studio every week to talk about an important issue on the global agenda. And today, I'm pleased to welcome my colleague, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo, Dr. Bessma Momani, who's just published a new book titled Arab Dawn, Arab Youth and the Demographic Dividend They Will Bring. And welcome and thanks for chatting about this fascinating subject. I have to say I learned a great deal from your book.
Thank you.
And it made me smile.
Good.
We hear a lot of bad press about the Arab world and about the dim prospects for the future of the region. Mm-hmm. And your book is actually a very hopeful one. So tell us a bit about what motivated you to do this and how you wanted to tell this counter-narrative.
Yeah, well, it's kind of cliche, but it's really the Arab youth that made me and motivated me to write the book. You know, I visit the region quite frequently for travel, for tourism, for friends, for family. And every time I meet young people there, they seem to be the epitome of everything that's not being talked about in the West. So we talk about a lot of violence and a lot of sectarianism and a great deal of sort of particularistic identities. And yet when I go there, I meet these young, cosmopolitan, young people, very educated, often fluent in English, who have none of these sort of characteristics that so often is painted, by the Western media about them. And I think that they're really the source of change, and that's what I wanted the book to point out, was not that things are rosy in the Middle East and the Arab world. There's a lot of change that needs to be done, but just that the Arab youth themselves are very different than the previous generation, that there is a social and cultural revolution, if we talk about revolution as the source of change, and a fundamental rethinking of society and life and politics and authority. These young people have fundamentally different views than their parents, which I think is something we need to celebrate, and I really hope that the book was trying to highlight a little bit about their views and how they think about the world.
Right, so tell us a little bit about how they differ from their parents. What are some of the key big differences?
Well, one thing, statistically is, I think, quite interesting is that they're very educated. I mean, they have sought after post-secondary education like no other generation. And in fact, the rate of growth is the fastest anywhere else in the world. That's what's quite remarkable. And it's generational. I mean, most families could, boast one or two of their kids having a university degree. We're looking at almost universality. There's just this great hunger for education in this young generation. And it's across gender, it's across socioeconomic status. It seems to be there's this enormous thirst for education that I think is really important, because my point of the book is that really brings confidence. It brings a perspective on life. It allows them to be more challenging of authority. They don't think of deference in the same way that the previous generation often did, sort of this resignation to the idea that somehow somebody else knows better, or that there are powerful actors in government who not just know better, but ought to be there because they're there for the sake of things like stability and the whole strongman argument. And Arab youth aren't like that. They're questioning and they're saying, no, I don't believe in that, and that's not convincing enough to me. The proof is in the pudding. Why are the streets have garbage? Why are you, still, the corruption, for example, which is so high on the minds of Arab youth. They often point to that and say, you can't be a person representing the public office and stealing public goods. So that kind of questioning, that conversation that Arab youth are engaged in, that I heard them talk about in person, but then incredibly so online. And that's what's so neat, is that the conversation is happening online in ways that many of us who are not looking for it, particularly us as political scientists, we're not doing the online searches to really find this material. It's out there, and I think it's quite revolutionary in that.
I was struck by one of your factoids that there are more university students in the Palestinian territories than in Hong Kong, which I thought was quite amazing. So education is one big difference with the parents' generation. What about political attitudes and gender attitudes?
Yeah, they're definitely changing. I mean, on the political one, I mean, I see this great questioning of authority. And in many ways, the Arab Spring was that. It was really saying to political bosses, no, you need to be accountable to me. And that's fundamentally different than previous generations, whereby it was sort of course, espoused by a lot of propaganda from government that somehow people need to be quiet and there are all these enemies and you need to be complacent. Don't expect democracy because A, you're not ready for it. We have all these enemies and all that kind of state propaganda that dictators threw at their people. That just doesn't resonate at all with the young generation. They refuse to believe it. And so they're questioning it and challenging it. I mean, in terms of gender relations, that's interesting too. That's changing from everything to the fact that women are almost at, actually exceeding men in university education in the Arab world. They're increasingly going into the workforce, so that's changing the relationship in the household. And we're starting to see some of the same, I think, arguments and fight that many liberal feminists had, in the Western world in the 70s and 80s starting to happen in the Arab world. So there are changes. I mean, I think on gender relations, that's a lot slower than, say, perhaps some of the political views, but nevertheless, it's out there. And I think that's something that needed to be pointed out. And my book was really trying to just at least bring that to life.
And do you think the education piece is the driver of these other changes? It's more basic?
Absolutely. I think it brings so much confidence. I know that word sounds parochial in some way, but that confidence is really important because that confidence allows them to challenge authority. They're not afraid of weapons. They're not afraid of jail. They're not afraid of being, put in these situations because they feel that they have a fight worth fighting for, and they also have confidence that many people share their views. So they're more challenging of political authority, and that really stems from, at the end of the day, I mean, I often heard it from these young people. They would kept saying, I'm more educated than that person in power. That person in power is not there because of their merits. They're not there because of meritocracy. They're there because they know someone, because of nepotism, because of money. I should be there. I have ideas. And I love that sort of spirit of not only questioning authority, but saying as well, I can do better. Give me a chance to govern, give me a chance to play a political role in life, and I could do something for my community, my society, and my country. And that kind of confidence can only come when you have that education basis.
Mm-hmm. So when you're well educated, you tend to have high expectations, especially
Absolutely.
high economic expectations. How are the opportunities matching up with the expectations in the Arab world?
Yeah, that's exactly it. In fact, I mean, I think that Ted Gurr, the classic historian who talked about revolution as an expectation gap, is precisely the Arab Spring. I mean, it really is about saying, I deserve better. And this is what Arab youth keep saying. I mean, they say it in many different forms, but at the end of the day, they're saying, I deserve better, and I know better, and I want to be a part of change. In terms of what their economic opportunities, it's still, quite poor. There's a lot of room for improvement for governments to actually get real jobs to their people. And obviously with so much political tension in the region, it's not easy convincing foreign investors to come and invest. It's not easy getting the kind of economic, good housekeeping seal of approval that is needed to bring that kind of investment into these countries. But one of the things that I found fascinating is that Arab youth are not waiting for government handouts in the way that previous generations did. I mean, you can see it generationally. You would have this resolution amongst an older group who would say, I'm waiting for the government to give me a job, quite literally, versus this generation says, I don't expect, government doesn't serve me anymore, and I don't expect a job from the government, I'm making my own job. And so entrepreneurship, for example, is one of the ways that they're filling the gap. And there is this startup nation that is happening throughout the Arab world that is quite remarkable. Is it enough to absorb all of unemployed youth? It's not. This is not a panacea to say that entrepreneurialism is going to be a solution. And there are agencies, whether it's the World Bank and others, who can tout it to the point of, I think, over-optimism. And that's not the goal of the book. But what I want to say is that with that entrepreneurialism, that drive, it's again back to that confidence. It's again saying to many of the, I think, leaders in power that, you're not serving me anymore. And in fact, one of the things that entrepreneurs face is that glass ceiling because of cronyism from the government elite as well. So they're challenging them head on. And I find that there are a lot of small to medium enterprises who could be one of those that are able to really scale up in their enterprise, but really face those ceilings of corruption. And they're challenging corruption through the business environment, which is quite interesting. But the reality is the quality of what they're doing is sometimes far better than what the cronies can provide, that the market is also basically determining success here. So there's a lot of challenges. I'm not suggesting in any way, the book is never trying to sugarcoat, and that's kind of the disclaimer I have, because I feel like, as a political scientist who's very critical of the need for change in the region, I don't want that to be the point of the book. But what I want to say is that the young people are taking on the challenge. They're not passive. They're absolutely not passive.
And where's the capital coming from for the entrepreneurs?
Well, everything from sometimes it's within their own communities. There are some really interesting online initiatives. Crowdsourcing has become a really popular way of getting entrepreneurs off the mark, and even some really interesting organizations. I mean, Silatech, EEF. There are some really interesting small microcredit programs that are helping. And in fact, one of the things that I talk about in the book that I think as a policy prescriptive is to think about our foreign aid commitments, because we need to start avoiding foreign aid in the terms of particularly military aid to governments, and start thinking about getting money to young people who really do want to change their society, and in the end employ far more people in these small entrepreneurial enterprises than you would find in just giving foreign aid through either military or top-down kind of aid.
Right. My sense from your book was that the governance of the region is not very business friendly, in part because of the cronyism and the corruption, but also in part because of the lack of infrastructure, banking, markets, and so forth and so on. So what are some of the governance changes you would recommend to really liberate this pent-up demand for entrepreneurial talent?
Yeah, well, and actually, sort of just to qualify what you said, I mean, I think that there are some countries that are doing well, right. Some better than others. I mean, the Gulf countries actually have made, massive improvements to allow not only foreign investment, but to create the kind of business climate that is conducive to growth. So there are some success stories, and there are some laggards. I mean, still you have in Egypt a great deal of barriers to investment that need to be, I think, surpassed if they're going to see any sort of long-term economic growth in their country.
Are the success stories all the rich petro states?
Some, but no, I mean, Jordan, Morocco have done some great things, I think Tunisia as well. And this follows many of the countries who have liberalized over the past 20 years. It's not just overnight. Many of the countries in the 1990s started to invest in liberalization, joining organizations like the WTO, organizing or joining organizations more actively in the World Bank and the IMF through some of the structural adjustment policies. So all of that has opened many of these countries to foreign markets. And that's not always a positive. Sometimes that brought social ills. But nevertheless, the legal framework, the regulatory framework has been broken down to eventually, I think, make the environment conducive. But again, yes, there are crony capitalists in every part of the Arab and Muslim world. I mean, there's just no doubt they're there. But I think one of the things that we're seeing is that even in some of the Gulf countries, those enterprises that are being celebrated are often these small and medium-sized enterprises. So even creating this kind of national momentum, like places like the UAE, whereby many of these small enterprises are being celebrated, is actually a very good thing on a national dialogue, because it allows people to say that, look, we can do more if we just allowed these young people to really shine.
Mm-hmm. Now, a lot of these countries, as you also note, have enormous public services. So the proportion of the employed population that's on the public payroll is huge. I think you said ranges from 40 to almost 80% in some cases. Presumably that has to change. How does that change? Are there good examples of countries actually slimming their public payroll and opening up opportunities for those people in the private sector?
Yeah, definitely. And in fact, one of the things that I found fascinating is that there are deep attitudinal changes about even working in the public sector. So, previously we would see, a decade ago, and some of these statistics are still, that were done to really measure generational change in attitudes, whereby young people today in many parts of the Arab world don't want to work in the public sector. They prefer to work in the private sector. And that's quite different. That's a sea change in terms of values and attitudes, because previous generations really did depend on the state for employment and often waited till the state called them and said, okay, now you're a teacher, now you're a public servant. children. So that's really interesting. And one of the things that we've seen that I think makes this quite remarkable is that in some places, like in the Gulf countries, working for the public sector is actually a higher wage than in the private sector. So you have an attitudinal change among young people who are willing to work for less money, but want to be in the private sector because it's more dynamic, it's more interesting, there's more opportunities for travel, there's a lot of great things happening, including a more multicultural workforce as opposed to the public sector, and specifically speaking about the Gulf, which is very much only dependent on nationals. So that kind of attitudinal change I think is important. It says something about this lack of expectation, right? Even though many of Arab youth say, I deserve better, they're not thinking of the state as being better. They're seeing the state as being a laggard in development. So the private sector is often one that's looked at as success. And people, when they point to success stories of companies around them, they're not looking at the public enterprises. The public enterprises have the worst service. They have, all of the characteristics of a bureaucracy that people want to avoid. So it's also the environment, the work environment. As, Arab youth become more educated, many of them are studying abroad and coming back, they also don't want to be in the public service, which has that kind of a greater tendency towards nepotism, greater tendency towards complacency, not basing success on merit, and they don't want a part of that. So that's really important. That's part of the attitudinal changes that I'm seeing in the Arab youth who do want to join the private sector and be more prosperous.
Right. Now you talk about the Arab youth as being interestingly complex in terms of identity, very well connected. I was surprised at the connectivity figures. These are people who don't live in an insular world. And they don't see tensions, for example, between secularism, practicing religion, liberal democracy, Sharia law. From a Western perspective, these all sound completely inconsistent.
Absolutely.
So obviously we were misunderstanding what's happening in the region. And I also assume we're misunderstanding what we see as sort of the backlash, sort of the conservative, very traditional Islamic/jihadist rejection of a lot of these values, which seem quite comfortable to the Arab youth.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually one of the things I think that really opened my eyes. It's something that I had a sense of, but really digging deep and asking questions finally clarified it to me. We have this unbelievable fixation on assuming that one has to be liberal, Western, and comes with that all of the package of liberal values, and with that secularism, or one is of faith and religious, and in the case of Islam, practicing Muslims. When I went to the Arab world, and the caveat here is that not all Arabs are Muslim, but I spoke to many Muslim Arabs, they were very, I think, surprised that we keep talking about these terms in dichotomous ways. They're very happy with being a hybrid. I mean, this is the term that I kept hearing. They're both. They don't want to choose. They want to be practicing Muslims who have faith, who believe in principles of Islamic life, but are very Western, and not just consumerist Western. I mean, this is really important. They want meritocracy, which I think is a liberal Western value. They want democracy. 92% want democracy, which is a liberal Western value, and Western liberal democracy, right? They don't want to live in a theocracy. I mean, this is another thing that I think we often ask, in our surveys, and the mistake that we make is asking Arab youth of faiths, asking them, do you want to live within a secular society? The word secular society, I mean, just on that word, secular translates into Arabic meaning godless, which is not what they want. But then you ask them, do you want to live in a theocracy? The answer is absolutely not. I mean, there's no desire to live in a theocracy. Now, as a political scientist, I see a theocracy and I see secularism as the two natural, antonyms, but they're not to them. They're very different. They want to live in a society where they have freedom of religion, where they can be a person of faith. And one of the things in my book I think may be surprising to some is that for many older generations, particularly in some of the liberal Arab countries, you had to be a liberal person that shut off your faith, that you actually had to disguise your faith, which is something that we don't understand. I mean, Turkey is a model that we know with the Ataturkian principles of secularism forced people, but I think in high society, in media, in so much of public life, particularly Muslim women, but also Muslim men, could not be practicing in the public eye, which I think people would find very surprising. And young people today reject that. They say, no, I want to be, it's often in the fashion I found very interesting. Muslim women would say, I want to wear my hijab, but I want to wear all the latest fashions from Zara and Mango, and I see no contradiction in that. I want to be very stylish. And that's something that I think we can see that. We see that on the streets of Tirana, we see that on the streets of Amman and the streets of Cairo, but that's exactly the way that they feel about their identity. They want all of the great Western comforts and values and ideas, but they don't want to shed their Islamic character, and they still want to be a person who believes in the value of family and all the other sort of Arab cultural characteristics that are so prominent to them.
Well, I think you've done us a great service by helping us correct some of our misconceptions. And it's true that these misconceptions are everywhere. It seems to me, based on the book that I enjoyed and our chat today, that we don't actually have a conflict in the world now between Islam and the West. We have a conflict within Islam. And maybe that's a hopeful sign. Maybe what we're seeing that seems so bad in the headlines is actually the last gasp of an intolerant version of Islam, and that the youth will provide a tolerant, interestingly complex hybrid future for the Middle East. Place obviously full of opportunity.
Yep.
So thanks for coming in and talking to us today, and to the audience, thanks for joining us. And please join us again next time on Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgionline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube.
For family, and every time I meet young people there, they seem to be the epitome of everything that's not being talked about in the West. So we talk about a lot of violence and a lot of sectarianism and a great deal of sort of particularistic identities, and yet when I go there I meet these young, cosmopolitan, young people, very educated, often fluent in English, who have no
Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Bessma Momani on Arab youth. Hello and welcome to Season 6 of Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. I'm David Welch, CIGI Chair of Global Security at the Balsillie School of International Affairs, and also a Senior Fellow here at the Center for International Governance Innovation. And it's our pleasure to welcome a guest into the studio every week to talk about an important issue on the global agenda. And today I'm pleased about the dim prospects for the future of the region. Mm-hmm. And your book is actually a very hopeful one. So tell us a bit about what motivated you to do this, and how you wanted to tell this counter-narrative.
Yeah, well, it's kind of cliche, but it's really the Arab youth that made me and motivated me to write the book. I visit the region quite frequently for travel, for tourism, for friends.
Please welcome my colleague, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo, Dr. Bessma Momani, who's just published a new book titled Arab Dawn, Arab Youth and the Demographic Dividend They Will Bring. And welcome, and thanks for chatting about this fascinating subject. I have to say I learned a great deal from your book.
Thank you.
And it made me smile.
Good.
We hear a lot of bad press about the Arab world, and